Story of the Windlenot Museum, Chapter 15, Exupi Hunt. Michael McNeil was glad to be out of the spooky stairwell and hoped they wouldn't have to climb up it again. After seeing that monstrous maw ready to devour them, he was becoming a believer that horror films could become real. Not that he would admit it when he survived this night. He started to get up as his friend Richard Cale and reporter Carl Kolchak were still catching their breath. After that scare, and the fact that they had been up all night, they needed to calm themselves down. But not to the point where they would fall asleep. He started to pace, hoping the movement would not only help him think, but stay awake. All right, let's figure out where we stand for a moment. As he paced, he paused when he heard Richard say, "I'm not standing. I'm still trying to catch my breath after almost being eaten." He glanced at his friend just as the seriousness in his voice disappeared in a fit of giggles. "Gee, that would just make everyone happy at school." Michael started to get a bit worried about his friend. He had never heard Richard say anything like that before. However, some of his concerns were appeased when Carl got up and said, "That's just the tiredness talking. I know you can handle this. Most other people would have lost their wits about now. We are a special breed, albeit a reluctant one, but still special. I'm sure there are soldiers who would not be able to cope with what we are dealing with here." He wasn't sure if he agreed entirely with Carl, but he noticed the giggling Richard had been doing had calmed down. He walked over as Richard slowly stood up and yawned, causing them all to yawn. When the yawn ended, he heard his friend apologize. "Sorry about that. When I start needing sleep, I get a bit silly. But let's get back to the here and now, and not the grim futures. Where do we stand?" Michael looked up at the lobby ceiling, letting his gaze fix on the chandelier the crystal Exupi attacked him from. He could just see it right now, waiting to attack them again. He even swore he saw a greenish tint in the chandelier, but put that out of his mind. "As I can figure, we've captured half of the Exupi in the building. That should leave us with only 5 left in the building. We also have found all the pots of the escaped Exupi and the spirits of the victims." He noticed Carl nodding in agreement. "Right, Michael. And in turn, we can now exonerate Sir Windlenot from any wrongdoing. However, we are no closer to getting out, nor capturing the rest of the Exupi. The only thing we have to getting closer to catching the rest is this Exupi pot from the subterranean room, whose markings we've identified as sand." Michael watched as Carl pulled out the pot and looked at it again. This time he took notice of the top of the pot, where the lid was supposed to match up. Due to all their searching, he was sure they had found every pot and every lid. However, he wasn't entirely sure where he saw it. He also noticed that Richard joined them in studying the pot. Soon he was stunned when Richard blinked twice and said, "I think that matches the lid we saw in the alchemy machine, up in the inventions room." With the trek down from the highest levels of the museum down to the depth and the scare, Michael had hoped they wouldn't have to go all the way back up again. However, he was feeling that wasn't the case when Richard confirmed his thoughts. "Yes, the lid we saw up there is a match. We head up there, complete this pot, and then capture the sand Exupi." He then headed over to the steps and started up. "All right," Michael said as he led the way back up. "We'll head up there, stopping at the tomb exhibit to leave the caught Exupi off, and then get the lid for that pot. Once we have the pot, Where will be the closest place to catch that Exupi? As they neared the chandelier, he heard Carl give an answer he didn't want to hear. I think the only places we've seen sand was in the plant room and maybe the mysteries of the deep room. Michael suppressed another groan, knowing it meant climbing up to the top floor and back down to the main floor, passing the waiting crystal Exupi he heard hiding above them. When they all had passed the chandelier and entered the tombs exhibit, he briefly let out a sigh of relief, and then watched as they placed all the pots they had completed into the Exupi tomb. As that was done, he heard Richard say, "You know, we should be able to recall where all the remaining things are. We might be able to save ourselves some grief and speed things up by using the secret passage when we can. It will take us straight to the room the sand pot's lid is." Michael was glad to hear that and walked over to the location of the hidden door. He turned the leaf as Richard came from the Exupi tomb, and Carl followed. He looked back at the others. "Remember how to get to the room?" When they both nodded, he started into the secret passage. He quickly moved through the passages, avoiding the path to the fortune teller room and other dead ends. He made sure the others were still with him, since he still didn't want to get separated from them. Soon they had climbed the steps, and he opened the panel that led to the inventions room. As they entered, and they headed for the machine they found the pot lid in, he heard Richard remark, "You know, all this time, I've never noticed the rooms each had some music playing. I guess it was supposed to match with the theme of the room." He listened for a moment and nodded. "Yeah, it does sound like it matches." With all that was going on, I didn't take notice either, except in the Inhumanities room. He noticed both Richard and Carl shuddered when they thought of the room next to the one they were in. He then saw Carl grab the lid and bring it over to him. "Here's the lid. Let's hope it matches." He held up the pot and wasn't surprised when they fused together. In fact, it was good news to him. It meant another Exupi would be captured. After waiting for a moment, he was surprised when he heard Carl say, "Now, is there a quicker way down all the flights? I don't think we want to run through those passages again, at least right now, nor all the rooms if we know where to look." He was surprised when Richard spoke up. "The elevator in the secret passage. I think it's the same one we saw in the passage that was behind the library." Michael remembered that elevator, that they only stepped in to get the clue to open the door to the tower. He nodded and let Richard lead the way into the passage and to the elevator. When he reached the elevator, he watched as Richard went to work to open the elevator. He turned to look at Carl and decided to ask a question that was starting to nag him since he first saw the tomb exhibit. "Hey, Carl, do you ever get a feeling of dread, like something is trying to warn you that you may encounter something later?" He watched as Carl nodded. "I've had that feeling a lot in my life, Michael. I remember one time, while walking through a museum in Las Vegas, before the vampire incident, getting a feeling of dread when looking at the dinosaurs. Little did I know that in Chicago I'd encounter something like that there." After hearing that, Michael wanted to mention his feelings when it came to the images of the pyramids, but was interrupted when Richard said, "All aboard!" He looked to see the elevator open, and they all entered. Once Richard pushed the button, they felt it lower. For the first time, he took notice of the elevator music and how upbeat it sounded. It was a welcome thing, with all the incidents during the night, and he could see how it could stick in one's head. Part of him even wanted to whistle along. However, the trip was over before he even tried. They all left the elevator and made their way through the library, main lobby, and into the animal room. For a brief moment he could swear he heard a metallic sound coming from a unicorn statue in the room. He glanced over at it for a moment and noticed the metal had a greenish tint to it, but then headed over to the plant room. They could catch the metal exupy later. Once they were all in the room, Carl handed him the sandpot. "I think you should have the honors this time, Michael." He glanced at both Carl and then Richard, who just shrugged. "Hey, so far you've only caught one. We've both caught two. Besides, I could see it is in there. The sand there has a greenish tint." Michael nodded in agreement and held the pot in front of him. As he got near the dirt, soon he heard the sound of sand flowing. He took a deep breath and said, just as the creature started to form, "I hope this isn't the wrong pot, or I'm going to be mad at you two." He then turned his gaze to the creature, which looked like it would attack, and then howled in fear. Soon the sand appeared to flow into the pot, and the creature was captured. Carl Kolchak had snapped a picture as the sand exupy was sucked back into the pot. He was glad he was taking all the pictures and hoped Tony wouldn't put a stop to the story. However, with the current trend in television, Tony might just let this story slide, especially with these pictures. He put the camera away when Michael walked over to them. 6 down, 4 more to go. Any suggestions which one we should catch next? It was a good question in Carl's mind, since their choice would determine many things. Many of those factors were where the exupy could hide, and remembering where the pots and lids were. However, he was also getting tired and hoped movement would keep them awake. He glanced over at the door to the animals' room and remembered what he heard. "I think I heard the metal exupy in the animals' room. If I remember right, it was in the unicorn statue in there." He noticed that Richard was giving him an odd look. "That's odd. I thought the unicorn was in the legends room. However, I could be mistaken. It is lucky that the pot was in the animal masks in the lobby." He watched as Michael was already to the door. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's get the pot and then get the lid." He noticed that Michael paused before continuing. "Which I think is the one all the way on the bridge by the skull door." Carl let out a groan, since he knew it meant heading through the Inhumanities room again. After a moment, they all headed through the animals room, pausing for a moment to listen for the metal exupy, but there was no sign of it. Once they reached the lobby, Carl opened the center mask and picked up the pot. Afterwards, they headed up to the tomb room. Once there, Carl watched as Michael placed the sand pot on its place and then head to the secret passage. But a thought crossed his mind. What is stopping those spirits from releasing their captured members? One would think they would break the others free. As they started through the passageway, he was surprised to hear Richard come to a very thought-out conclusion. Maybe the spell that binds each exupy to a pot also prevents them from freeing a captured one. I'm sure if we were to try and capture the wood exupy in the metal pot, it would scatter the pot after attacking us. However, it would not touch one we had a captured exupy in. As they reached the 3rd floor, he heard Michael chime in. "I never thought of it that way. You know how in stories the villain goes to great lengths to protect what would hurt them the most? They make sure you can't access it with ease, and in the same way draw attention to it." Carl nodded. "It is crazy, but true. I once incurred the wrath of a headless specter because I wanted to return its head. I succeeded, but I almost met the business end of a sword. However, I think that would have made the officer investigating the killings very happy. He thought back to that officer, remembering how a character on an old television show looked very much like the cop. As they passed through the inventions room and into the inhumanities room, the conversation kept their minds off the room's atmosphere. He heard Richard speak next. "You must have made a few cops upset over the years. Did they all believe your stories or thought you were nuts?" Carl gave a wry smile. To be honest, I think a few did. When it came to the Parma Fey, the captain had to agree that I had given credible points to the times of the attacks and the reason for the attacks. Even the cops in Vegas had to give my theories, even though at the time I had believed it was a man thinking it was a vampire. Credence. He sighed at how they then used it to get him out of Vegas. When they finally reached the bridge, he couldn't believe that the conversation had them bypass the rooms without taking notice of the sounds. He then reached down and picked up the lid, which instantly fit to the pot. He was about to turn and leave when he saw Richard approach the skull door, with all the skulls glowing. Before either he or Michael could say anything, Richard had pushed the door open, and they were all surprised by what they saw. The next room was plain, with just a round stone on the wall with 2 hieroglyphs on it. It also appeared a part of the floor was wooden, but nothing else. While Carl watched Richard observe the room, with almost a pose mimicking the actors who had played Sherlock Holmes, he heard Michael say, "It's just a dead end." Kind of anticlimactic. I was expecting something more thrilling, but at least there are no exupi in there. Something in his gut told him Michael was incorrect. But it wasn't until Richard spoke that he knew he was right. There is something more to that room. There is a surprise in that room, and once we solve the riddles we saw earlier, we could find out what that room means. He then watched as Richard started to leave the room. He and Michael quickly caught up as Richard led the way through the inhumanities room. Carl had a feeling what Richard was thinking, but cautiously said, "You think the missing riddle will lead to the reason of the room?" He watched as Richard nodded. "It's playing a key part. Why else would the riddles be so hard to find? Unless they weren't intended to be difficult to find." Carl wondered that as well, since the third riddle was missing, unless it wasn't meant to be hard to find. As they neared the exit of the room, Michael said something that made him realize Michael had the same idea. What if the page was hidden by those creatures? That would mean there is a bigger reason for this. But what would it be? Before they could leave the inhumanities room, the announcer's voice came to life. "So you would accept your fates and die? Your kind is a plague that needs to be rid of. You have brought so many others misery, Carl." Carl felt his blood boil at that, as well as a bit of remorse. It was true that sometimes his investigations had impacts on others. One was the temporary job loss of his friend and editor, Anthony Vincenzo, but he always bounced back. However, before he could tell the creature off, he heard that it changed its focus. "And you, Richard, I see some of the thoughts in your mind about the girl. We would be doing her a favor killing you." He glanced at Richard, who was turning beet red. Carl could only wonder how long Richard and Ron's niece had been together, and didn't want to ask how far they went. He quickly put his hand on Richard's shoulder, who was now not going to be much of a help until he calmed down. He then looked at Michael and said, open the door and let's get out of this room. We need to book it out of this area." He watched as Michael nodded and then opened the door out of the room. As they ran out, Carl heard the electric Exupi say, "Yes, Michael, lead them to their doom. If you don't forfeit yourself to us, that will be the fate of any who follow you." He was glad when Michael didn't react, and even more glad when he closed the door and they started through the rest of the museum. As they moved through the inventions room, he noticed that Michael started to head towards the secret passage. Carl shook his head. "It's better we take the long way down. One, I don't think we want to go any place with minimal lighting right now. Two, taking the elevator is out of the question since I'm sure Richard is in no mental shape to solve the puzzle. And three, if we come across the metal Exupi in another hiding spot, we can nab it." He watched as Michael nodded in agreement and headed towards the door to the planetarium. He was stunned when Michael took a step back and said, "Lead the way. I think I should step back for a moment." Carl nodded, a bit surprised since he was sure Michael hadn't been affected by the creature's words. However, as they continued through the planetarium and the following rooms, he noticed that Michael was trying to stay alongside him and Richard. Finally, by the time they had reached the shaman room, Michael spoke up. "You don't think what that thing said is true? That I'm going to lead people to their doom?" Carl thought about it for a moment and shook his head. He noticed it made Michael feel better. "Thanks. I really think I could, if this crazy situation were to play out again, keeping everyone safe that I came across. Mind you, I don't want anything like this to play out again." Carl could understand where Michael was coming from, but to be honest, he highly doubted it. Just as they started towards the door to the tombs room, he heard Richard finally speak. "How did that thing know?" Carl looked at Richard and stopped, seeing that Michael had done the same. He realized that Richard had been referring to the fact that the Exupi had somehow deduced how Richard felt about his girlfriend, Yvette. They had reached the lobby before he could even ask, but as they descended the steps, he heard Michael say, "Rich, any ideas on other possible hiding places for the metal Exupi?" He watched as the young man started to walk around in around the central display case. He wasn't sure why Michael even asked that question, until the other young man quietly said to him, "He's not aware of it, but I once saw them kissing in the library. I didn't say anything, mainly because I didn't want to embarrass them. But while they were kissing, their hands were wandering a bit. Nothing indecent, but signs that they are in love." Carl could now understand why Richard was unnerved, having been in similar situations. Of course, at his age, he had done more than Richard and Yvette had done, but he was glad they weren't as active as he had been. He then quietly said to Michael, "I'm sure if he were to know, he'd thank you for not saying it aloud. I won't say a word. I just knew the words hit him hard, and it had to be that he really cares for her." He would have said more, but it was at that moment that Richard stopped at the far end of the display case. There was all the movie cans in the projection room, as well as the clock chains in the clock tower. If I remember right, there was a suit of armor in Professor Windlenot's room as well. I even think there was some scrap metal in the hidden passageway. Carl let out a whistle as the thought of running all over the museum to capture the metal Exupi could be a tricky matter. All this time, they were sure that the Exupi would only pick specific places. Now he was sure they were thinking the same thing. The hunt for the remaining Exupi could be much harder. Finally, Carl headed for the door to the animals exhibit.
Well, before we start trying to chase it around, hoping to find the correct hiding place at the right time, let's check the metal unicorn.
He heard the two follow him, and they all entered the room. As he walked over to the statue, his ears were assaulted by the sound of what he guessed to be sheet metal rubbing together. He knew what it meant and held out the metal pot in front of him. Soon, the creature jumped out and howled in anger as it realized it was being pulled into its prison. Soon, the creature was captured, and for a moment, Carl felt like he was years younger, even though he was sure he didn't look it. He was sure, however, that they had only 3 more Exupi to catch. Richard breathed a sigh of relief after the metal Exupi was captured. Now there were only 3 Exupi left in the museum. Of those 3, he felt like they couldn't get the electric Exupi yet, and their only other choices were the wood Exupi and the crystal Exupi. Now all they needed to do was decide which one to go after. He then glanced over at his friend, who still looked 10 years older than he actually was, and he knew the choice was clear. Just as Carl put the metal Exupi pot away, Richard spoke. "Hey, why don't we catch the crystal Exupi next? That way, both Michael and I will be back to our normal appearances." He watched as Michael's eyes lit up, realizing what Richard was saying. "Of course. During all this time, I almost forgot about catching the crystal Exupi." He then watched as Michael let a scowl cross his face. "However, I think I just remembered where both parts of the crystal Exupi's pot are." Richard thought for a moment and remembered where the pot was. "The bottom part is up in the clock tower." He then heard Carl let out a groan. He turned just as the reporter said,
"And the lid is back in the planetarium. This is going to be a long trek. I really hope we don't have to do too much more climbing tonight. At this rate, we may collapse from exhaustion before we can finish capturing the Exupi."
Richard nodded in agreement. He had walked to the museum from his home. It was a good mile or so, but it was a walk he was used to making. Of course, he usually only looked around for a bit and then walked home or to a vet's, but he was never gone more than an hour or 2. He had never expected to be climbing up and down several flights of steps. Despite that, he opened the door back to the lobby. "Maybe, but if we don't keep going, we will end up trapped in here. I'm beginning to think that the Exupi allowed us to enter, but kept the doors locked so others can trap more potential victims." In his mind, he knew it was horrifying, and showed that the creatures had a level of intelligence that they never considered this whole time. As they ventured through the lobby and into the theater, he started to wonder if other supernatural creatures were the same. As they continued into the tower, he slowed down to walk alongside Carl. If anyone would know, it would most likely be the reporter. "Hey, Carl, have you ever encountered something like this before, where a group of supernatural creatures work or seem like a family?" He heard Carl sigh, and the reporter took off his hat again.
"You may not know this, but for a few months, the service I was working for fired me. As it happened, it was at that time I was contracted by someone in the town of Collinwood. As it turned out, the story of my adventure in Las Vegas had reached them, mainly because the vampire I killed was sired by a vampire that they sired. Mind you, some time had passed and they had been cured of their vampirism, and they wanted to congratulate me on destroying a very evil vampire."
As they reached the top of the tower, Richard heard Michael comment, "You mean to say that vampires can be good? That doesn't even sound right." He watched as Carl nodded in agreement.
"I thought the same way. But after talking with him, I found out a lot about his life and how he had fought some other creatures. When I left Collinwood, I had been contacted by my former editor and was informed I was back on the payroll. Apparently, the former vampire had contacted them and asked for me to be reinstated. He stated he would also allow a special interview, which was something he never gave. Since then, I've walked a narrow road, but did my best to make it work. Plus, with the recent popularity of shows like Unsolved Mysteries, my editor's bosses smile upon the occasional weird story.
Richard was stunned by that news. However, it wasn't as important as the crystal pot that Michael now held. He glanced at his friend, who now had the pot in his hands. When they asked, "Now, where was the lid again?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment to think, and he briefly thought Yvette was rubbing his back. She would do that when they were staying together. It would distract them a bit, but it made him feel good. In fact, he didn't want to open his eyes, but when he heard Michael yelling, "Richard, wake up! We need to find the lid to this pot," he came back to reality. He shook his head for a moment to wake himself up and apologized. "Sorry about that. I didn't expect to nod off. Anyhow, I think the lid to that pot is in the UFO in the planetarium. Then we'll have to find the right hiding spot to catch it in." He watched as Michael motioned toward the ladder back down to the stairs. "All right then, Rich, lead the way." Richard swallowed and then led the way. To be honest, he never liked being a leader, but he didn't like being a follower either. He also knew that the guy in the lead was always a target. They quickly went down the tower and crossed through the theater and climbed the steps in the lobby. As they neared the top of the steps, Richard glanced at the chandelier and noticed its greenish tint. It was obvious that the Exupi they were going to catch was in there. However, he knew it was dangerous to stare too long at it. Once they were in the tomb room, he heard Carl say,
"Before we go any farther, let's put the male Exupi with the others."
He nodded and watched as the reporter put the pot with the others. As they then continued through the museum, the walk helped Richard stay awake, although he was sure his thinking would be impaired a bit. He was even starting to feel jumpy around all the statues. The shaman statue startled him for a moment, as well as the wooden statue in the gods' room. However, he put that out of his mind. They needed to capture the crystal Exupi now. As they passed through the myths and legends room, he paused for a moment. It was the sight of the horse that caught his eye. He heard the others move past him for a moment, but for some reason he looked at it. He wasn't sure, but part of him swore the horse was Pegasus now, instead of a unicorn. But he just could be sure. The one thing he was sure of was that he heard something. After a moment he heard Michael say, "Rich, we are all tired and need to focus. We need to get to the planetarium." Richard then brought his mind back to the task and turned toward the door. During that turn, he realized what the sound was. The sound was of timber creaking, and it was the sound the wood Exupi made before it attacked. He had turned to face its hiding spot, and it came out of the wood that was by the statue, looking like an animated tree stump. As its claws raked his body and left no physical scar, a cold chill went through him as he felt paralyzed. However, he felt two pairs of hands grab him. He was aware of Carl shouting,
"I should have seen that coming. We got so focused on capturing the crystal one and so tired we forgot about the wood one. Let's get him to the steps."
Soon he was dragged out to the steps to the planetarium, and he inwardly cursed himself for falling prey like that. However, it did wake him up more. When he finally could move again, he got up and said, "I shouldn't have walked into that. I should have remembered that one was still about." As he started to climb the steps, he heard Michael say, "Hey, we are getting tired. At least the Exupi don't outnumber us now." Richard had to agree to that, but it made him eager to capture that one. He had recovered from the last attack he fell victim to, and now was back to the same state that Michael was in, and so close to when Michael would be back to normal. When he reached the UFO, he watched as Michael grabbed the lid and then turned to go back the way they had come from. However, he started towards the door to the inventions room. As he opened the door, he heard Carl say, "Hey, we should go back the way we came, unless you think it's quicker to go to the secret passage." Richard nodded and watched as the two followed him. They quickly entered the passageway, and Richard led the way to the elevator. After the attack, his mind was racing, and the puzzle to open the elevator was easy, even though the puzzle was increasingly difficult than before. Time seemed to fly by as the elevator opened, and they rushed down to the lobby. Once they reached the lobby, Richard looked towards the chandelier and was shocked to see it was no longer tinted green. As he looked, he wondered where else the creature could be, since he only remembered that being the only crystal object. As he stared on, he heard Carl say, "I just remembered something. In the mysteries of the deep room, I think they had power crystals in there. Maybe our fleeing Exupi is down there." He quickly nodded and followed Carl and Michael into the next room, and down into the mysteries of the deep room. Once they arrived, he watched as Michael went down the side wall and stopped before the very display. He had already noticed the green tint in the yellow crystals, and wasn't surprised when the creature jumped up, only to try and flee from its prison. Its attempted escape was thwarted, and as the creature entered the pot, Richard smiled as Michael returned to his normal age. That also meant there was only 2 Exupi left, and he was certain which one they would catch next. Tony Vincenzo sighed as he got up from the couch he had in his office. To be honest, that office was a home away from home, especially when Carl was on an assignment. Of course, that was because of Carl's history. Despite that, Tony always kept Carl on the payroll, and if he couldn't, he'd find a way to get him back. It wasn't because Carl was a bad reporter, or had a tendency to find the wild stories, but it was because Carl did his job. Now, with the latest trend in media and shows, Carl's crazy stories were becoming popular. Deep down, he had wished that he had managed to keep copies of the old stories, but that wasn't likely. He even thought Ron, being the person he was, would have kept some copies of those stories. However, Ron said he didn't know about the old stories. Tony then peeked his head out of his office and looked at the few workers there at this hour and shouted, "Anyone here from Kolchak?" When all shook their heads, Tony grumbled in disgust. When he didn't hear from Carl, it was a sign that something big and weird was coming. He then went over to his desk and saw the paper his boss had handed him. It was the reason he sent Carl on the assignment in the first place. His boss had found out that one of the real-life mystery shows was going to do an episode on some disappearances that had happened 15 years ago. It also involved a museum that was devoted to the unusual things. That was another reason his boss suggested the story go to Carl. However, Tony did want the story to go to Ron, since Ron would stick to the story and maybe elaborate on the museum. But he had left to visit family. Deep down, he was afraid that Carl might try to get to the bottom of the mysterious disappearances, and even try to put some supernatural spin on them. For a brief moment, Tony chuckled to himself. If Carl did manage to do that, they would have a scoop on the show. However, if it did have a supernatural angle, he worried that Carl might not be coming back. He then sighed again and looked on at the phone. As he looked at it, he just thought, Carl, I hope you call when you can. He then returned to getting the day's paper going and hoped it would keep his mind off the worry.